The next step in my process, after I am done drawing my subject on my 8x10 piece of paper, is I now want to erase my graph lines. Whenever we do a graphite drawing, or really any type of drawing in which we use a grid to help us draw the object, we want to remove the grid before we start shading, because the grid was a tool to help us draw the object to proportion and to scale. So now we no longer need that grid. So I'm going to erase the grid, and then I'll be ready to start applying some value in graphite to my main subject. So I now have my drawing complete with the grid erased. My next step is to start adding value. So I'm going to need, of course, my drawing, and remember the grid needs to be erased from the drawing before you start applying value. I have my original photo reference, and I have graphite pencils. You do not need a full array of drawing pencils to complete a pencil drawing. An HB pencil will usually work fairly well to give you some very light values and some very dark values when you need them. So your pencil selection is up to you. If you're in building, then you will have these different grades of graphite pencils available to you. If you are at home, you may not have those. So just a regular number 2 HB pencil will work for you. So to begin, the first thing I want to do is identify the object that is going to be my center of interest or my emphasis in my drawing. And as I have already talked to you before about, that is going to be my glasses. Now, since my glasses are going to be the emphasis in my drawing, they're going to eventually be done in colored pencil. So I do not want to apply any values to my glasses. So that means I need to make sure I identify all the parts of the glasses. So it's not just the frame that is facing us, but there is a small area here and a little area here that is part of the glasses. It's the legs of the glasses going backwards into space. So those areas I'm not going to apply values to. So the rest of this I am going to shade. Now, even though this is a furry textured dog, there's a lot of areas in which I'm going to be using circular shading. Remember, there's the two types of shading. We have circular or smooth shading, and we have directional shading. Directional shading is great for areas where you need to bring out texture. So looking at my image, I can see around the nose will probably be areas in which I will get into directional shading. Now, directional shading is very purposeful. It is not drawing individual hairs. It is not scribbling back and forth. It is moving your pencil in the direction you need to complete a value, and develop texture. So it's going to be a very purposeful movement. Areas where I probably won't need directional shading include up here. Even though I have some areas of light and dark that indicate some texture, they're not very distinct. They're more grouped together. So these are areas in which circular shading or smooth shading would work best. My goal is that when I apply the value, that the value is just helping to create form and texture in my object and not distracting from the viewer. So when you start this, it doesn't matter where you start, but I would suggest that you have an extra sheet of paper, and this could be any type of paper. It could be a piece of notebook paper, it could be a piece of paper from a copier machine, it could be another piece of paper from your sketchbook. But whenever I start working with pencil, I like to put an extra piece of paper under my hand that is going to hold the pencil, and that is because as I am shading, my hand is going to move on the surface it rests. And the only trouble is if I don't lay down a piece of paper underneath my hand, then my hand is just moving over top of my pencil, and it's going to cause it to smear and smudge. And I want to reduce that and keep that from happening as much as possible. When I do start shading, I'm going to try to, as best as I can, match the values that are present in my drawing. So even looking at my drawing, even the lightest spots on my dog are not pure white. So if I bend my copier paper over here, you can see the corner very distinctly, because what appears white at first is a very light gray on my subject. So understand that sometimes areas in which you think there's no shading at all, you will want to check that up against an actual sheet of white paper, because most likely it's going to be a very light gray value. All the time? No. There are, of course, areas in which you're going to have some pure white. Usually it's a very bright highlight. But most of the time, what you'll find is what you perceive as white in your photo reference is actually a very, very light gray. So I'm going to choose an area to start my shading. And as I said, most of these areas are going to just use circular shading. And I'm going to apply those values to my drawing. So I have the top part of my subjects completed. Now, as I mentioned when I first started this, a lot of it in this area where the fur texture is blurred out, not in focus as much as the area on the nose. This is mainly circular shading. So this area and down here below, I'll be using that technique. But here, where I'm starting now in with the nose area, I'm going to start getting into some directional shading. So as I mentioned previously, when I start adding or working with directional shading, it's still a very controlled movement. I am not drawing individual hairs, but I am looking for the grouping of different values, their thickness or how thin they are, and the direction in which they move. So working with an animal, I know that what I'm looking for is that at the nose area you have the hair growing out away from it. So if you look at my photo reference here, you can see here the direction in which the hairs are pointing out away from the nose, and as I come around the nose they start pointing down and away from the nose. And here at the upper lip area of the dog, it starts to a split, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, but still coming from the nose and working its way around and away. The only place that goes against the grain is right at the top here, where there's a couple of little hairs that fall over and forward on to the nose. If this was smoothed back, it would still come from the nose and back out away in both directions. So pay attention to what your subject is and the movement that the values are creating. If you have some sort of fur animal like I do, then those are areas you want to look for, is which direction is the hair growing? When is it appropriate to use circular shading? When is it appropriate to use directional shading? If you're using some sort of other object, then you need to observe the types of values and which type of technique would be best to use to show those values to create the form. So I'm going to pick back up where I had left off, and that is starting to work on my snout here. I'm going to have a combination of both circular and directional to develop the values on the fur around the nose. Okay, so I'm about finished with my dog. I have a few touch-ups to make with my values. Just adjusting things as I darken areas, some areas that were brighter may look too bright now, so I'm going back and toning those down to get a little bit closer to my image reference. So as I make adjustments, I'm just going to again kind of look over my entire image, double check to see if I've missed anything, and make adjustments as needed to help it look a little bit closer to the image reference. Once I have this done, then my next step is to work with color pencil, and that is going to be taking color pencil and of course filling in my area of emphasis, and in this case for my image it's going to be the glasses. So that is the next step once my graphite is finished, and that is what we're going to talk about in the next video with our emphasis project. So don't forget, as you work through this, to distinguish between when to use circular shading, when to use directional shading, and to have your photo reference nearby so that you can constantly look and check and adjust things as they are needed while you work. So I'll see you in the next video when we'll talk about adding color pencil to our area of emphasis.